Hello. Thank you for coming on today again. You're my final guest, funnily enough.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Since the last time we spoke, you've started uploading again to the YouTube page of GNC Films, with your most recent episode of Cutting Edge being about The Equalizer 2. Why a specific film?
I thought it would be interesting to look at a more recent film, perhaps, than we've done in the past. A lot of our films have been ones that were released in the 80s and the 90s. We have done some from the 70s. I thought it would be good to look at a film that was not only recent, but also had received an uncut release as well. Some of the films we've looked at before, we examined what was edited from them, and there's still no uncut version available. With The Equalizer 2, it was a little odd in the sense that there are two versions on the market in the UK. There's the edited 15 version, which is on DVD and Blu-ray, and then there's the uncut 18-rated version, which is only on 4K Blu-ray. That seems to be a common trend in the UK recently, I've noticed.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think it has become such a common trend then? Because if I'm not mistaken, the original Equalizer is only uncut as well on 4K. Is it just for monetary purposes, do you think?
I believe so. I think it's a way of the studios trying to get us to adapt to the next home video format. I do have a 4K Blu-ray player myself. It's actually the Xbox One. But I don't have a 4K monitor, so I can't enjoy 4K movies. And to be quite honest with you, I'm very happy with the quality that a regular Blu-ray can provide. So it'll be a while, I guess, before I'm on the 4K bandwagon. But yes, I do think it's monetary reasons.
You talk about not being necessarily on the 4K bandwagon yet. Why is that the case?
Well, I think it's a mixture of being quite happy with regular Blu-ray, as I said, but also it's a monetary thing. You've got to buy a whole new television screen, and that's not something that you just walk out and buy. I don't think. It needs to have some thought. You need to research the models. You need to see if you can get the best deal. And really, it's just not high on the list of things I need to do in life right now. I think that's the main reason.
Do you think it's becoming maybe, like, in some cases, maybe slightly gimmicky, like the same way 3D was, like, about a decade ago? Like, you had to buy a 3D TV, or, you know, you were, like, that sort of... Do you think it's, like, maybe partially a fad then, maybe?
I don't really know. That's a good question. I have thought about that before. And to me, 4K hasn't really exploded in the way that other home video formats did. A lot of people think that physical media is dying out, which I don't agree with. There are still many companies out there, like Arrow, that are putting out special edition versions of movies month in, month out. I don't think physical media is going anywhere. It does still feel like early days for the 4K format, but it hasn't exploded in the way that I thought it would.
And do you think with digital becoming, I guess, somewhat more popular, do you think the film censorship around that is going to get better or worse? Because a few years ago we saw the film Hate Crime be banned in this country, the first streaming film be banned. Do you think that's only going to... Do you think censorship is going to adapt to that? In what way do you think? How do you think film censorship, especially with bodies like the BBFC, how do you think they'll adapt to sort of like the new outlets like Netflix and whatnot?
As I understand, the BBFC provide age ratings for Netflix now. But it might be an issue if, say, an independent filmmaker, makes a very low-budget film and decides to release it online as opposed to on a physical medium. I would assume, at least in the UK, it would have to be rated. And if they've made something, let's say it's a horror movie, and this is completely hypothetical, they make some extreme horror movie, if that falls foul of the BBFC or indeed any laws in the UK, then I can see that being an issue. But we've had streaming for a while now, and I can't really think of any major hurdles that the introduction of streaming has made in terms of regulation with films, at least in the UK.
And why do you think from that horror films are often the most targeted sort of films when it comes to, at least say, the BBFC, especially in more recent years? They seem to be the films most frequently banned, whether it be Grotesque or The Bunny Game or the aforementioned Hate Crime. Why do you think those are the films that usually draw the ire of the censors as much, next to maybe, say, some more extreme action films as well? Why do you think the horror genre specifically? Is it just because it's the one most likely to push boundaries?
I think that's fair to say, yes. There are horror films that mix like sexual violence in there with regular horror, and that's always been an issue, I think, for any censorship mainstream Western censorship body, as it were. I think horror, perhaps more than any other genre, has to reinvent itself every now and then. And really, I mean, you look at what has spawned from things like Hostel and the Saw films. Horror films weren't exactly like that before they came along. We had the comeback, let's say, of the slasher movie in the 90s. At least that's what I used to think horror was. So, I think there's something about the horror genre where every now and then you'll get someone who comes along who wants to shake the genre up a little bit. And I think that might be why, in the past, it's always been a bit of an issue with a censorship organisation.
And how do you feel that there are still horror films to this day from the 80s? I'm thinking mainly here stuff like The New York Ripper, and I think it's called The House at the Edge of the Park or something like that, where those films are still censored after 30 plus years, nearly 40 years if I'm not mistaken. Do you think those films are still justifiably, censored because of their sexual violence, or no, not really because of how dated they probably are?
In the case of The New York Ripper and House on the Edge of the Park, the only edits in those films now are to specifically sexual violence, and that's always been an issue with the BBFC. They're a lot less strict now than they used to be under the reign of James Ferman, the former director of the board. It's a tricky question because obviously I don't agree that anything should be cut, but there's nothing we can do about it really. It will be interesting to see if, let's say, another 25, 30 years down the line, that those films are available uncut. As I said, the board's stance on sexual violence is not as bad as it used to be. So perhaps in another 25, 30 years, things will be different.
And from that, are there any films that you've seen that were formally banned by the BBFC that you were very surprised after when they were, unbanned? Like any sort of like those films that have come out afterwards and you've been a bit disappointed about how maybe say dated they were, for example?
Not that I can think of. I can remember being impressed by how good a movie Straw Dogs was, and I remember thinking, why was this banned? This is a great film by a great filmmaker. So that's the only one I can immediately think of.
Do you think maybe on that front then that it's more surprising that they banned it, given, as you covered in that episode, the Straw Dogs episode, James Ferman liked the film as well, it's just he felt that he didn't feel it should be released. Do you think there's some weird sort of contradiction with that he also liked the film but didn't feel it was right to release it or something like that?
Yeah, that we've discussed James Ferman a lot in our show, and I'm sure that there are people who are getting sick of hearing about him. But yes, I haven't quite worked the man out. I don't know if I ever will. There were other films that I think that were edited under his reign just because he didn't like them or thought they were poor. But yet you get a well-made film that he respected, and that it's almost like he had this internal fight about, well, I like this film and I don't think it should be cut, but at the same time we have to cut it. And I think even though I don't suppose he's no longer alive, but I don't suppose if you asked him he would ever say that he used to cut films that he thought were bad and leave films uncut that he thought were good. But there did appear to be hints of that happening during his reign. I've never quite worked the man out really.
And especially, do you think there was maybe some hypocrisy during his reign? Because, for example, he refused to allow The Exorcist, he didn't ban it, but he refused to allow it to be, allowed on video. But he allowed something like The Evil Dead, which is more violent than The Exorcist, albeit in a cut form, to be released. Do you think there was some hypocrisy maybe on that regard? I'm not saying either should have been banned or anything, just saying some of the weird hypocrisy with that.
The Exorcist, as well as being a great film, has got very little physical violence in it. Very, very little. Whereas The Evil Dead is, it's been a while since I've watched it, but it's there's a lot of heavy violence in that. But of course, they're two completely different films in that The Exorcist is very straight-laced and very serious, and The Evil Dead has its tongue firmly planted in cheek. With regard to The Exorcist, I'd never quite understood his reasoning behind not releasing it, which was, as far as I understand it, it was just that now's not the right time. And it never seemed the right time. And of course, once he left, it was one of the first things that got classified. I bet Warner Brothers were overjoyed that James Ferman had left the board, and resubmitted it, and it got an 18 uncut immediately, as it always should have done years ago in the past. So yes, he did have some odd hang-ups like that. I really don't know what he meant by it wasn't the right time. Whenever Warner Brothers asked about The Exorcist, he always said it wasn't the right time. Well, what is the right time? I would have loved to have known what his reasons were. I'll never get to ask him, of course, unfortunately.
On the next thing I wanted to ask was, like, if he was, still alive today, how do you think he would feel about the way the board was going now?
Well, obviously, it's very hard to say. I didn't know the man. I only know of his work and some of the things he was responsible for at the BBFC, so it's completely hypothetical. But I think he would probably agree largely with the BBFC and how things were after he left. I think even in his reign, I mean, he was at the board for 25 years, I think. The shifts that occurred during that quarter of a century, you have to move with the times. And I think whilst he initially might have been, I wouldn't say horrified, but I think he might have been surprised at some of the things that the BBFC did after he left. I think over time, I'd like to think he would have come around to it and realised that they had to move with the times.
Do you think some of the way the BBC, especially under James Ferman, conducted themselves, sometimes, as you were talking about, like, edited version, was to sort of quell public outrage? Because you've, for example, talked about in some of your episodes about how, say, the Hungerford Massacre of 1987 affected sort of the way they did things in terms of action movies, for example.
Yeah, we mentioned this in the episode on Rambo 3 on the show. There was an examiner that said if they make some edits, at least they can say they've cut it, if there was any kind of outrage. The immediate example I can think of that was similar to that was the Columbine High School shooting happened in, I think it was 1999. And Scream 3 was in the process of being made, and because of what had happened at the school, they made a conscious effort with that film to lighten it up a little bit, because there was the age-old argument in some realms of the media that said that violent movies were to blame for things like school shootings, which I don't believe. So yes, in hindsight, I don't think it would have made any difference if they'd released the version of Scream 3 they wanted to release. And I really don't think the UK would have been any worse off if Rambo 3 had originally been released uncut. But there is sometimes this knee-jerk response to the handling of the regulation of movies because of something that's happened in real life. And Rambo 3 and Scream 3 are the immediate examples I can think of.
And the next question I want to ask is, you've covered video games on GNC Films, with the Great Manhunt series being the first ones you covered. I think I might have requested them at one point. Do you plan on covering more video games in the future, like controversial ones like Grand Theft Auto or maybe Bully or something like that, for example?
We have a long list of, let's say, media that we look at every year and think what would be a good episode to do this year. And then there are a couple of video games on there. Our plan is to look at least one of those in the near future, but we haven't actually started work on any of them yet. We're still working our way through Season 5, so there is a chance, but it's way too early to say what those video games will be and when those episodes will be out. But we do plan on looking at some, yes.
And are there any films or any sort of media that you refuse to do on GNC Films or Cutting Edge either because of legality issues or because you just personally don't want to do them, or the people at GNC Films and Cutting Edge just don't want to do them?
There hasn't been anything we don't want to look at, but there have been a couple that we want to look at, but we're not sure if we'll get away with uploading them to YouTube because of the content. And one of those is I Spit on Your Grave from 1978. It would be good to do an episode on I Spit on Your Grave. It would be a hard watch, arguably, for anybody, I think, especially if you're not familiar with the film. It might be something that we end up doing as a Blu-ray only release. I don't know, but we'll have to wait and see, I guess.
And from that, have there been any films or any media that the GNC Films guys and the Cutting Edge guys have seen that they've looked at that they haven't particularly liked in terms of, as in, like, they haven't liked the film per se? Is there any films that have come in that you've not particularly liked?
Not that I can think of. I think it helps that we, at least on some level, like the film or the game that we're looking at. I think if you don't like it, then it's hard to be enthused about it, and therefore probably that would translate to a rather boring episode. So it does help to like the films that we look at. It doesn't mean we have to love everyone and think it's our favourite movie, but it does help that we like them. And as far as I know, we've done 50, soon to be 57 episodes now. And I think every single one of those films or video games we've looked at, we like.
You talk about films that maybe, you say you enjoy most of the films that come in, all the films in the media that come into GNC Films. What's been sort of like the favourite film that you've covered so far in terms of like ones you've legitimately really enjoyed?
I think it probably would have to be Cliffhanger. It's one of my favourite action movies. They really don't make action movies like that now. I've always loved the film. It was one of the first films that I was aware that was cut when I first got into looking at film censorship in the UK. So I'd seen it many times in its cut and uncut version, and I knew that was a film we had to look at. And even though I knew what had been removed, I assumed that a lot of people wouldn't be aware of it and its history as I was. So I think that might have been the favourite episode.
Do you think that there are any recent films that have been released, or latest films that have been released in British cinemas or otherwise, that have got like ratings that you're surprised that you feel maybe have been a bit too low on the maybe?
I don't actually see a great many new films because a lot of them don't interest me. So I can't immediately think of anything that I thought was classified too lowly. Although I read some news articles not long after the BBFC's annual report came out, and Red Sparrow was a film that a handful of people had said was underrated and that it should have been an 18. Even though it was cut for a 15. But I haven't seen that, so I can't comment. But off the top of my head, in very recent years, I can't think of anything that was classified too low. I do remember seeing Bad Boys 2 when it came out, 16 years ago, I think? And I do remember thinking at the time that was a pretty strong 15. Having watched it since then, I think 15 is probably fine. I certainly don't think the original film, Bad Boys 1 from 1995, I don't think, if that was resubmitted now, I don't think that would be an 18. There's nothing in there that's really 18 level in my eyes. I did ask the BBFC about that film once, and they said that the issue at the time wasn't the violence, it was the bad language that really made it the 18, which I was very surprised at because I always thought it was the violence. But no, I can't immediately think of anything recently that was rated too lowly.
You talked about bad language being a problem with that time. Looking at some of your episodes, whether it be like the Die Hard episodes or some of these other episodes, are you surprised that how much of this, about like a lot of the censorship during the mid-90s for the BBFC came down to language, given that arguably perhaps violence leaves a stronger impact?
Before I was aware that it was cut, I used to think that Die Hard with a Vengeance was quite a strong 15, mainly for the language. I mean, this is like 20 years ago or more when I first watched it. And then I got the uncut version in widescreen on VHS from Australia, which was great because I'd never seen it in widescreen. And of course, there's like twice the amount of bad language in the uncut version. That made me realise how tame the 15-rated version was. It is odd with regards to that film, and also Die Hard 2 that came before it, and Cliffhanger is another one that had some language edited. It is odd that they were removing uses of fuck and motherfucker from 15-rated films. And then you had a film, what was that one that Alec Baldwin's in it and Kevin Spacey, Glenn Ross or something like that. And that was released in what,
1992.
92. So that was a couple of years after Die Hard 2 and a few years before Die Hard with a Vengeance. And the language in that was left entirely alone. And I believe they used the word cunt. And that wasn't in 15 films a lot then. And yet they didn't request any cuts for that. Again, I think that's that hypocritical James Ferman way of thinking there. I don't know why that film was left alone, but yet you would request words that were less strong to be removed from another film with a similar rating. I don't understand that.
Why do you think there was such, outrage about language then, I guess, especially in these action films? Do you think it's partially because maybe, say, Glenn Ross was more like a serious drama which a lot of teenagers wouldn't see, as opposed to something like Bad Boys or Die Hard 2 or Die Hard with a Vengeance, which teenagers are more likely to see? Do you think there were worried about sort of those films having a bigger influence on, say, the youth of then?
That's one argument, I think. They might, well, I don't know the way they were thinking, obviously, so again, I'm just theorizing, but yes, there might have been an element of how many 15-year-olds are really going to want to watch this. But I think the main thing, and a similar thing happened with the film Closer, is that the films were based on a play, and plays don't have an age rating on them. It would seem, therefore, silly to rate it as an 18 when a lot of viewers under that age would have already seen it and would know what they are in for. Perhaps that's what happened with Glenn Ross, I don't know.
Well, one of the other things, we're nearing the end of the show, talking about more political stuff now, because that goes hand in hand with censorship. In the United States right now, because I know that's where you live, what is like the current mood around censorship, do you think, in terms of like whatnot, especially because President Donald Trump recently talked about violent video games being allegedly behind some of the recent shootings there or something like that?
Yeah, that's, again, it's an argument that has been mentioned before. It happened during the 1990s when things like NBK were being blamed for real-life violence. I don't think, and the evidence shows, that there is no link between these horrible real-life events and things like violent movies and violent games. If there was, logically, then we'd all be out there killing people, wouldn't we? And that isn't happening. So there's more to the argument than just like saying, oh, it's violent movies and violent video games. I'm sure certain violent films and certain violent games probably have an effect on individuals who are already, in whatever way, mentally unstable. It's not just the games and the films themselves, I don't think, and the evidence would suggest that I'm right.
And I think this is probably going to be the final question I'll ask you, again, talking about politics. Given in the UK, Boris Johnson is currently fronting the government, what do you think are going to be sort of the problems with censorship, maybe from that sort of angle over the next few years, especially given that government's, legislation against pornography, for example?
On the face of it, on the little that I know about it, I don't think that's an issue. I think it's right that we protect youngsters from those kind of websites. I don't know how it would be implemented or what knock-on effect that would have for households that haven't got any children. I don't know. But at the very basic level, I don't think there's an issue with having age verification on these adult websites at all. I think that can only be a good thing. But as I said, I don't know a lot about it or how that's going to affect internet users in the UK. But on the face of it, it sounds like a reasonable idea.
Sure, yeah. So thank you, Gavin, for coming on today. You're my final guest. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. It's always good to be here, Edward.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.